Hello, my name is Afshin Marashi, and I'm the director of the Farzaneh Family Center for Iranian and Persian Gulf Studies here at the University of Oklahoma. And on behalf of everyone here at the center and at the university, I'd like to welcome you to the OU Iranian Studies podcast. Our primary goal with this podcast is to publicize the research that is being produced by Iranian Studies faculty here at the University of Oklahoma. We also hope to use the podcast to record conversations with visiting scholars who come to OU to give talks. We actually have a rather active visiting scholar program here at OU, and we'd like to give both our local listeners here in Oklahoma and everyone else around the world on the web who might not be able to attend our on-campus talks, give them a chance to hear from some of our visiting speakers. So that's also one of our goals with the podcast. And since this is the first of what we hope to be an occasional series of these brief conversations, we thought we'd begin by recording a conversation with one of our own Iranian Studies faculty here at the University of Oklahoma, Professor Manata Hashemi. Manata, welcome to the OU Iranian Studies podcast.
Thank you so much for having me. It's exciting. It's my very first podcast.
It is for me too, and this is so far so good. This is fun.
Yeah.
Manata has been at OU since I think 2015. Is that right?
2015, that's right.
And she's my colleague here in the Department of International Area Studies. She received her undergraduate education at Cornell and her graduate training at Harvard and Berkeley. And your primary field is sociology. I guess your PhD was in sociology at Berkeley.
That's right. My PhD was in sociology. I got my master's in Middle East Studies from Harvard.
And you finished the PhD 2012 or?
2012, that's
okay.
right. Yep.
And you've published widely in sociology journals and in Middle East Studies journals. You also have a forthcoming book coming out with NYU Press.
Mm-hmm.
Before we talk about the book, I'm wondering if you can say something about your approach, your methodology to your work in general. Would you describe it as ethnographic?
Yeah, I would. To be more precise, I would say it's participant observation based on sort of looking at observable patterns in behavior and speech and thought and practice among people. And I guess maybe I should say a little bit about what got me interested
Yes,
in
that'd be
ethnography.
Great. Sure, yeah.
So I'm really interested in sort of big issue questions that sociologists are known for, class inequality and poverty. And I'm interested at looking at it within the context of the Middle East and more specifically for now, Iran. When I was in my early years of grad school, I interned actually for an NGO. Mm-hmm. in Iran focused on poverty alleviation. And I started to read up on the literature to see what was out there. And to my surprise, there wasn't, and this was, I would say it was in the late 2000s, so around 2008, there wasn't that much written ethnographic studies on poverty in Iran. There was a lot before the revolution. Right. But the stuff that was coming out at that time was really focused on the elite and the upper classes, so not a lot of work on the lower classes. Of course, we have Asif Bayat's famous book, Street Politics, and Farhad Kazemi's book, Poverty and Revolution in Iran. But those were a little bit, they're focused on the years immediately after the revolution, not so much the time period that I was looking at. And so, I wanted to really be part of that conversation, and that's what sort of got me interested in the topic.
Well, I mean, within the field of Iranian studies, that's one of the things that really makes your work kind of interesting, because ethnography has had a kind of ebb and flow within the field of Iranian studies. Yeah. And prior to the revolution, there was probably more ethnography than certainly in the 80s. Yeah. I mean, when I was an undergraduate, the Erica Friedel book and the Mary Heglin's work was sort of the place that you would start in thinking about ethnography. I think both of those the research was done mostly before the revolution, and it was sort of a rural focus.
Exactly. It was mostly focused on rural populations. Yeah.
I mean, the other person that always comes to mind is Michael Fisher's book, which was sort of an ethnography of the ulama in the 70s, really. Mm-hmm. And I remember that book came out, I guess, in the early 80s, but there was even an earlier kind of mimeographed manuscript copy that had circulated around called the Qom Report that I actually had seen a copy of even after the book was published, which is really interesting.
Interesting, yeah.
So that's kind of the early history of ethnography.
Yeah.
After the revolution, there was much less of that.
Yeah, so I mean, exactly. I think before the revolution, we got a lot of these fascinating ethnographies and sort of everyday life and what people were doing, and it was very detailed. And then after the revolution happened, starting around the early 2000s, we start to get ethnographies largely focused on, you know, the upper classes, the elite, particularly youth in the upper
Right.
classes and the elite. But, you know, there was always this tension between state and society, always pitting state versus society. So the idea was that, you know, we have this repressive, you know, Islamic state, and we have these rebellious, resistant citizens who are trying to sort of make do given all these constraints that they have and trying to fight against the state and these authoritative power structures.
Right.
And it really didn't, you know, I was at the time, you know, I left Iran when I was very young, but I kept going back every year, and it didn't really jive with what I was seeing on the ground. It didn't really jive with some of my later graduate work. And I really felt that, you know, it does a disservice to understanding Iranian society when you always talk in terms of binaries. Yeah.
Well, I mean, I think that's right. I mean, one of the themes that you work with in your research is class in a broad sense. And in that sense, I think what your work does is approach the issue of class in a different kind of way. And you don't seem to be interested or focused so much on, you know, the traditional way in which we think of class, which is always in the context of class conflict or the politics of class or class as a kind of disruption that transforms society as sort of the root of that
Right.
process of transformation. There's
Right.
almost something more functionalist, I don't know if you would agree with that, with how you're approaching it, but looking at how class actually, you know, the gray zone of class, how class can be accommodated to kind of maintain a system.
Yeah.
Is that kind of maybe how you're thinking about class?
I mean, I would sort of situate it, and I think you're spot on. I would add to that. I look at it as an issue of sort of class mobility,
Right.
and sort of in traditional sociological studies of class and poverty, there's always this assumption that you can't say that somebody's sort of moved up unless they've sort of come out of their class of origin. Excuse me, they've escaped their boundaries of the class of origin. So upward mobility doesn't occur unless you get a better job or you get a certain level of income, right? And it's these very objective indicators of socioeconomic standing, what we call SES. But, you know, in my work, and, you know, I coined this term incremental mobility in the book, I think we have to look, yeah, those objective markers, I guess, are important, but we also have to look at subjective perceptions. So it's looking at people's own perceptions of their station in life, notions of relative gratification. So yeah, maybe I'm still poor, but, you know, this job that I have that may be a little bit stigmatized, that may not necessarily, you know, be considered a middle class job, it's still giving me social connections, it's giving me a sense of self-worth, and that's, I think, what's important to look at. So looking at all of these small incremental socioeconomic gains that people make within poverty,
Right, right.
that helps them to sort of move up the ladder. And so that's sort of my conception of class mobility within the book.
Well, I think that relates to one of the, I think, central terms that you use in the book is this idea of resistance versus conformity. Can you say something about that? I mean, this kind of comes out of the discussion of
Sure.
class, right?
Sure. Yeah. So the idea, I mean, within the social sciences, is that, you know, if you're poor, especially if you're a poor young person, it sort of goes back to James Scott's everyday forms of peasant resistance. But if you're poor, you're basically engaged in everyday resistances to sort of regain your dignity or reclaim your status. And there's this idea that, and this sort of is carried over into Iranian studies, and there's this idea that these youth in Iran are resisting and rebelling trying to regain the status that these authoritative power structures, whether it be the state or the family, they've sort of taken away from them. And, yeah, I mean, that's certainly true. There are some youth who are resisting, and I would argue that mostly these youth are from the elite who have the resources and the wherewithal to do it. But I also think that we have to look at conformity, how some people, and in the context of this book, young people, try to conform to social norms in order to regain dignity and claim status and move up the ladder. So, yeah, in this book, I really look at the ways that people conform in order to become agents of change, ironically.
So yeah, your ethnography or your field work was actually among urban poor young
Yeah,
people.
yeah, exactly.
So, that's interesting. I mean, it kind of relates also to this term that we're all familiar with in the culture of Iran, which is aberu, or just the concept of face saving or saving face. And you've kind of turned it into a sociological phenomenon, which I found one of the really interesting things in the manuscript. Iranians may have a kind of intuitive understanding of what aberuh means, but what's interesting is that it can also be analyzed or interpreted within sociological theory, which is kind of what you've done here. Can you maybe explain what aberuh is
Yeah, sure.
and how it relates to the sociology of saving face, as maybe as we
Sure.
would say in English?
So it's going to be a long-winded answer. So abru, literal definition is water of the face, right?
Right.
Abru.
Right. Like rosy cheeked almost.
Exactly. So in Iranian sort of thought, you have this veil of water that's covering your face, right? And once this veil of water is lifted, that's it.
Right.
That's basically, that veil of water is like the stronghold of your character. And once you lose that veil of water, you've lost everything. You might as well be dead, in a sense. So that's the absolute poverty, is when you don't have that abru. And I define abru just, shorthand way as face. Because it's hard to keep saying water of the face. So it's called face in the book. And for me, I mean, a central element of conformity, abiding by social norms, is saving face, is others' perceptions of your moral worth. And so I argue in the book that the better able you are to save face, to protect that veil of water that's on your face, the more morally good you're judged by those in your community, the more moral capital, to put it sociologically, you acquire, right?
Right.
And this moral capital is a form of symbolic capital. It can be traded in, it can be exchanged. And what I saw when I was doing the ethnography was that these youth exchanged that moral capital, not literally exchanged, but in a figurative sense, they exchanged that moral capital for social and economic capital, or for the possibility of social and economic rewards, right? So the better off, the more morally good you're judged, the more likely you are to gain a more decent job, the more likely you are to maybe gain a promotion, the more likely you are to gain social capital, social networks, or tangible resources. So in this sense, conformity not only allows you to gain dignity, right, in this very abstract sense of the term, but it also gives you these more tangible rewards that actually can help you later on in life, right? So these incremental gains can add up over time to something bigger that can ultimately yield a sense of status, yield a sense of self-worth to people who we normally think of as being sort of on the very bottom of the social hierarchy.
Right.
Yeah.
I mean, when I was reading the manuscript and sort of reading the parts where you kind of conceptualize these ideas, I mean, you can almost kind of intuitively understand it. And obviously, in your ethnography, you actually sort of saw it and kind of put it into a system. But it also reminded me of, Asghar Farhadi's films, like Separation, which
Yeah.
also kind of, delves into the kind of moral ambiguities of status and rank and identity and dignity and all of these things. I mean, obviously in film, and maybe in some ways, film has sort of become a substitute for ethnography to some degree in Iranian
It
studies or
has for
Iranian
sure,
culture.
yeah.
But in his films, all of these same issues that you're describing are presented as drama. But what you're doing, you're kind of turning it into a sociology or an ethnography. The other part of that in the manuscript that you kind of take it to the next level, actually, where you actually describe there's four rules
Right,
in which this whole system operates.
right.
You
The
know,
four
so
rules, the
yeah,
face rules.
the four rules of saving
Yeah.
face. I mean, that's it. That's kind of the system that you've kind of
Yeah.
devised in all of this. Maybe you can give us a
Sure.
short description of that.
Sure. Oh, I love the rules. So, so just to make it easier in the book, I talk about the system as a game. So I call it the face game, and I term the rules the face rules. And so for every game, there's a winner, right, and there's a loser. So these face rules are the rules that you have to abide by, the social norms that you have to abide by in order to win the game and maybe gain those social and economic rewards, right? And the four rules are sort of being seen as a hard worker, being seen as financially responsible, being seen as morally pure, and being seen as sort of with it, fashionable, in the know in a way. And I emphasize being seen because it's always the performative display of these norms that's important, right? So what you do in the backstage, to quote Irving Goffman, what you do behind closed doors, that's not important for your face, right? It's what you do outside in the public that's really sort of becomes the hallmark of your identity in this case. And so for these youth, by following these four rules, at least publicly, they're able to sort of move ahead in life. And I wanted to emphasize there's this idea that we have in Iranian studies, especially, there's always this dichotomy, this tension between the zahir and the batin,
Oh, yeah.
right? The external and the internal. And I actually, what I saw in my fieldwork was that there's no tension. These youth actually believe that this game, that playing this game is the morally correct way to live. And that's what's made this game so sustainable, is that because they believe that, yeah, you know, we might not necessarily follow these rules in the privacy of our own homes, but we should, right? Because that's the right way to be and act. So I also call into question. No, and I'm not the only one, but Fariba Adel-Kha has also done this in her excellent analysis of state and society in Iran. But
That's the Being Modern in Iran book. Yeah.
yeah, that we really need to step away from these dichotomies. We need to look at those gray zones, those overlaps, where
Absolutely.
people, where these social norms that we think are sort of imposed on people by the state or by communities or by families, actually they're internalized by people. And people want to follow them, want to do them in order to, because they think that that's the way that you have the good life, right?
Right.
And I put good life in quotations because, everyone's perceptions of the good life is different. But yeah.
Well, I mean, obviously this book, it's not a book about politics. It's not
No.
you're a sociologist and you're not interested in the politics of contemporary Iran. But for those of us who are, interested in understanding contemporary Iran, whether it's in sociological, ethnographic, or otherwise, the evolution of Iran's social, cultural, political system is ultimately rooted in some of these things that you're describing. So I'm wondering if you have any sense of, and maybe you've touched on this already a little bit, but how do you think your research contributes to these other kinds of discussions?
Yeah. So, I mean, after the Iran-Iraq War, the Iranian regime really embarked on this intense sort of developmental drive, this developmental push, to quote Kayvon Harris, where it tried to modernize Iranian society. It expanded education to all sectors of society. It instituted cultural houses, cultural activities, social welfare programs. And what all of this did was it ended up raising the aspirations of people. It normalized aspirations across classes. So we sort of see this embourgeoisement
Right.
of Iranian society beyond the middle classes, where people in the lower classes, so the people that I interviewed, also want the same resources and accoutrements that people in the middle classes or even the elite have. And I think what my research shows is that state has been successful. It's worked. The developmental project has worked. People's aspirations are raised, and it's not an issue of, oh, look, their aspirations are raised and yet they don't have any way of achieving them. No.
Right.
Even today, in spite of all these sanctions that are happening, in spite of all the turmoil, people are coming up with really creative individualistic solutions that are aligned with sort of social community norms in order to make those aspirations a reality. They might modify their aspirations, right?
Right.
But they haven't given up, basically.
Right.
They're engaged in this sort of creative struggle
Yeah.
to not just make ends meet, but live a life of dignity,
Right.
improve their lives. And I think that's what a lot of ethnographies miss, is that, well, people are just making do
Right.
with Iran. Iran's this horrible place. Why?
Right.
It has to be because it's an Islamic republic.
Right.
People are just trying to just like make do, that's not. I would say that's the wrong perception to have. I think there are people who actually enjoy living in Iran, people who believe in the value of that, of the Islamic regime, and are trying to improve their lives within that system.
I mean, and I think you're right, and it definitely goes to show how resilient and dynamic and creative and complex Iran is.
Yeah.
That all of these things that you're describing, I think people who do travel back and forth to Iran, they can kind of feel it in some
Yeah.
way. But I think what you've described here and sort of systematized really captures a lot of that. So all of this is really fascinating, and all of this is in the book. When is the book going to be published?
The book, inshallah, is coming out spring 2020, and
Okay.
it's tentatively titled. It's a working title. It's called The Face Savers: Morality and Mobility in Iran. It's
Great.
coming out with NYU.
Great. So
Yeah.
that's probably a little more than a year. We're recording this in February 2019, but so spring of 2020.
Spring 2020.
It
Yeah.
will be out in the world, and
Yes.
we all. I've already read some of the manuscript, and I definitely endorse it and give my recommendation.
Thank you. Thank you.
But thank you again, then, for joining us on our
Thank you.
inaugural podcast.
Thank you for having me, Afshin. It was a pleasure.
Yeah, well, our hope is to continue this tradition and to record more of these conversations with both OU Iranian Studies faculty, as well as visiting speakers who make their way to Norman, Oklahoma, for campus talks, and we'll try to record some of these podcast conversations with them as well. So thank you all for listening. Until next time, thank you. Bye.